At 11 o'clock on the night of March 4, 1762, a man named Elias Croft climbed 17 stone steps to the top of the Philadelphia Watch House on Chestnut Street, lifted a cast-iron bell weighing 11 pounds, and swung it 11 times over the sleeping city below, wind off the Delaware River. Torchlight. The sound carrying 6 blocks in every direction. He had done this the night before, and the night before that, and every single night since the winter of 1721, when the city first hired him at a wage of 3 shillings per week to do the thing no one else wanted to do, stay awake while everyone else slept, and tell them every hour that the world had not ended. He was 23 years old when he started. He would be 64 when they found him. This is the story of one man, one bell, and a system of local order so fragile, so dependent on individual human reliability that when it finally stopped working, an entire city had to reckon with what it had taken for granted. Before there were police forces, before there were paid fire brigades, before there were gas lamps or telegraph wires or any of the infrastructure that modern cities depend on, American colonial towns ran on a system called the night watch. The concept was not invented in America. English towns had used it for centuries, but in the colonies, stripped of the institutional weight of the Old World, it became something more personal, more improvised, more human. Philadelphia established its formal watch in 1751, though informal arrangements had existed since William Penn's original city plan of 1682. The job was simple in theory. A watch constable walked a defined circuit through the city streets from dusk to dawn, carrying a lantern and a wooden rattle. He checked doors. He looked for fire. He reported strangers. And every hour on the hour he rang the bell at the watch house to signal 2 things simultaneously: the time, for any citizen who cared to listen, and the fact that he was still alive and still at his post. That second signal mattered more than people realized. Elias Croft was not a remarkable man by the measures his era typically applied to men. He had no military record. He owned no land. He left behind no published writing, no portraits, no letters that historians have found. What he left behind was a series of payroll ledgers, maintained by the Philadelphia Common Council, recording 41 years of unbroken weekly wages paid to one E. Croft, night watchman, Chestnut Street District. The entries are mundane to the point of invisibility. 3 shillings, 3 shillings, 3 shillings, every week, for 41 years, until they stop. He had taken the position under circumstances that the ledgers do not explain. In 1721, Philadelphia had roughly 10,000 residents and a serious problem: fire. The city's buildings were crowded together. Candles and hearths were the only heat and light available. A fire starting in one building could take 12 before morning. The watch system existed as the city's first line of defense, and the bell at the watch house existed as its alarm. Croft apparently understood this. According to a single surviving account from a merchant named Samuel Bartram, who mentioned Croft in a letter written around 1748, the watchman had developed a code within the bell's ringing. The standard signal was time-based, 1 ring per hour, but Croft had introduced variations the neighborhood had apparently learned to read. A rapid cluster of rings meant fire. A slow double strike at an unusual hour meant strangers in the street. Bartram wrote that his household had come to treat Croft's bell the way later generations would treat a weather vane, as information, not just sound. How Croft communicated this system to the residents of his district is unknown. Whether the Common Council approved of it or even knew about it is unknown. What is clear is that it worked. The Chestnut Street District recorded no major fire losses between 1724 and 1763. Other districts were not as fortunate. The physical demands of the job were not trivial. The watch house was not heated. Philadelphia winters regularly fell below 20 degrees Fahrenheit. Croft worked through them. He worked through the epidemic years, 1730–1741, when yellow fever and smallpox moved through the city in waves that killed hundreds. He worked through the political tensions of the 1740s and 1750s, when the city's Quaker establishment clashed with its growing non-Quaker population over questions of defense spending and local governance. He worked through the 7 Years' War, when fear of French and Native American attack made the night feel less safe than usual to the citizens he was watching over. He never missed a payment cycle. 41 years. 213 consecutive entries in the ledger. The bell itself was replaced twice during his tenure. The first replacement was in 1733, when a crack appeared in the original casting that made the tone unreliable. The second was in 1754. In both cases, the ledger records a payment to a foundry and a subsequent payment to Croft for continued services during transition. He rang whatever bell they gave him. The bell was not the point. The ringing was the point. On the morning of March 5, 1762, a woman named Hannah Price, who lived on the south side of Chestnut Street, noticed that she had not heard the midnight bell. She had not heard the 1 o'clock bell either, or the 2 o'clock. She had been awake with a sick child, and in the long suspended hours of that vigil she had been listening for Croft's signal the way a sailor listens for a foghorn. Without consciously deciding to track it, she had been using it as a clock and a comfort. By 3 in the morning she was certain something was wrong. She sent her husband. He found Croft at the top of the watchhouse stairs. The man had died sitting down, his back against the bell housing, the rope still looped around his left wrist. The bell had not rung since 11 o'clock the previous evening. Elias Croft was 64 years old. The cause of death was recorded as apoplexy, the era's general term for what today would likely be diagnosed as a stroke. The gap in the bell's sound had lasted 4 hours. In those 4 hours, no fire had started, no strangers had caused harm, and the city had slept. The absence of catastrophe during those hours did not make the silence less significant. It made it more so, because what the city discovered that morning was that it had been leaning on one man's wakefulness for 4 decades without fully understanding how completely it had come to rely on him. The Common Council's response was immediate and practical. Within a week, they had reorganized the Chestnut Street Watch to require 2 constables on duty simultaneously, with mandatory bell verification between them. One would ring, the other would confirm. The single-point failure that Croft's death had exposed would not be permitted again. This was not sentimentality. This was engineering. But the reorganization also pointed to something the council could not legislate. Croft had done more than ring a bell. He had maintained, through sheer personal consistency, a form of public trust that had no formal contract behind it. The residents of his district had not been paying him to be trustworthy. They had been paying him 3 shillings a week to walk a circuit and ring a bell. The trustworthiness was something he had supplied on his own, without being asked, for reasons that no surviving document explains. The merchant Samuel Bartram, who was still alive in 1762 and still corresponding with business contacts across the Atlantic, wrote about Croft's death in a letter to a cousin in Bristol. "The city is quieter for his absence," he wrote, "though I do not mean quiet in the way we might prefer." Philadelphia would go on to formalize and expand its watch system through the 1760s. By the time of the Revolution, the watch had become a recognizable urban institution across all the major colonial cities, a patchwork of local arrangements that would eventually, over the following century, evolve into what we now recognize as a municipal police force. The process was slow, contentious, and expensive. Cities resisted the cost of professionalizing something that had always been done by individuals willing to work for very little. What got lost in the transition was not efficiency. The professionalized systems were more efficient. What got lost was the specific, localized, idiosyncratic knowledge that a man like Elias Croft had accumulated over 4 decades in one small district of one city. The knowledge of which doors didn't latch properly, which families kept candles burning too late, which corner collected wind in a way that made sparks dangerous. That knowledge had lived in one man's head and died with him. His replacement, 2 men, working in shifts, using a verification system, never developed a bell code. The residents of Chestnut Street adjusted. They learned to read time by the standard ringing and alarm by the shouting that came afterward. It was a reasonable system. It was a less intimate one. The watch house on Chestnut Street was demolished in 1799 to make room for a commercial building. The ledgers that recorded Croft's service survived in the Philadelphia City Archives, where they were catalogued in the early 20th century by a historian named Margaret Teeters, who noticed the unbroken run of entries and flagged them in a footnote as unusual. The footnote has been cited 3 times in subsequent scholarship. Croft himself has not been the subject of any dedicated historical study. The bell from the 1754 replacement, the one that Croft was still ringing the night he died, has not been located. It may have been melted down during the Revolution, when iron and copper were in short supply. It may be somewhere in a collection that hasn't been properly catalogued. It may simply be gone. What remains is the shape of what he did. 41 years of interrupted sleep so that others could sleep without interruption. A system that worked because one man decided it would, and kept deciding, every hour, every night, until the night he couldn't anymore. The bell rang for the last time at 11 o'clock. Then it went silent, and the city for 4 hours did not know.